A billionaire walks into a sterile ICU like he owns the air everyone breathes. He shouts over the monitors, shoves a resident, and demands a bed for a scratch. And then he slaps a 7-month pregnant nurse across the face in front of the entire staff, saying, "Do you have any idea how much my time is worth? Poor woman. Look at my hand. This is a $5 million scratch, and you're telling me I have to wait in line behind some dying old man in room 4? I donated $4 million to this wing. That means I own the equipment, I own the beds, and effectively, I own you. Now get that pregnant belly out of my way before I have you escorted out of this building in handcuffs." Nothing to say? Good. Next time, remember your place or call your husband. Yoon Byung-ho walked away smiling. He thought he'd just silenced a nobody. He had no idea that he'd just signed his own death warrant, because that nobody is the wife of Park Jin-woo, the shadow leader of the Korea Mafia. Please like and subscribe for more update from us. Now listen to the rest of the story and wait to see what he brought to himself at last chapter. No one moves to help. Not the doctors, not the security guards, not even the chief of medicine. So the billionaire smiles, adjusts his cuffs, and walks away thinking he's untouchable. What he doesn't know? That just a nurse he silenced is the wife of Park Jin-woo, a man whose name isn't found in Forbes, but in the nightmares of every criminal in the country. And by the next morning, the billionaire's empire won't just fall, it will be erased. The ICU is a world of steady beeps and the sharp scent of antiseptic. In this unit, a wasted second is a stolen life, and for years, Se Hyun-jung has been the calm that holds the chaos together. At 31, she is the lead nurse the younger staff calls when a family breaks down or a patient codes at 3 a.m. She is professional, composed, and 7 months pregnant. Her back aches and her feet throb by hour 10 of her shift, but she never mentions it. She simply rubs her belly, takes a slow, stabilizing breath, and keeps moving. To her coworkers, she's a mystery, a woman who smiles but never talks about where she grew up or who she goes home to. They think she's just a dedicated nurse who chose a quiet, normal life. Hyun-jung had spent years building this separate reality, shift by shift and patient by patient. She had once sat across from Jin-woo and asked for the one thing his money couldn't buy: a normal life. "Let me just be a person," she had told him, and he had honored that request with a terrifyingly efficient silence. He kept his world of dark sedans and heavy debts entirely away from her, allowing her to earn a life that was hers alone. As the afternoon light began to fade against the hospital windows, Hyun-jung checked the monitors in room 6. The air smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation, a familiar scent that had become her sanctuary. She preferred the life and death clarity of the hospital to the murky complexities of her husband's empire. Here, the rules were simple: preserve life, maintain the rhythm, and stay invisible. She didn't realize that the peace she had fought so hard to maintain was an illusion that could be shattered by a single entitled hand. For now, she was just a nurse, exactly as she wanted to be, unaware that the double doors at the end of the hallway were about to slam open. The sterile peace of the ICU was shattered not by a medical emergency, but by the heavy, rhythmic thud of expensive leather loafers against the linoleum. Yoon Byung-ho didn't enter the unit, he invaded it. Behind him, two assistants scrambled to keep pace, their faces masks of practiced terror. Byung-ho was a man who moved as if the world were a series of rooms he already owned, his dark business suit sharp enough to cut the very air. He held his left hand aloft, cradling it as if it were a wounded relic, though the only visible injury was a jagged, superficial scratch across his palm, a souvenir from a malfunctioning glass trophy in his boardroom. At the central station, Han Soo-yeon looked up, her eyes widening as she recognized the face from a dozen magazine covers. "Sir, you can't be in this section without authorization," she began, her voice wavering. Byung-ho didn't even look at her. He scanned the hallway until his gaze landed in room 4, where the door was propped open for a patient recovering from a massive cardiac event. "I need a doctor, and I need this bed cleared," Byung-ho barked, his voice echoing off the metallic surfaces of the ward. "Now." Hyun-jung stepped into the hallway, her hand instinctively moving to the small of her aching back. She took in the scene with the clinical detachment that had become her shield. She saw the aggressive tilt of his chin, the way he squared his shoulders to dominate the space, and the triviality of the blood bead on his hand. "Sir, this is a restricted intensive care unit," Hyun-jung said, her voice low and steady, a sharp contrast to his jagged energy. "If you have an injury, the emergency room is 3 floors down. This bed is occupied by a patient in critical condition." Byung-ho finally turned his focus to her. His eyes raked over her light scrubs, her ID badge, and then lingered with a sneer on her visible pregnancy. To him, she wasn't a medical professional. She was a servant who had forgotten her place. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am Yoon Byung-ho. I don't wait in lines with the masses, and I certainly don't take directions from a nurse who looks like she should be on maternity leave." He took a step forward, closing the distance until he was towering over her. The assistant stayed back, frozen in the elevator light. The air in the hallway turned brittle. Hyun-jung didn't flinch. She had stood before men far more dangerous than a tech billionaire, men who dealt in blood rather than stocks. "Your status doesn't change the triage protocol, Mr. Yoon," she replied, her gaze locked onto his. "You are not a priority here. Please leave, or I will have security escort you out." A dark, dangerous flush crept up Byung-ho's neck. He wasn't used to the word no, especially not from someone he considered invisible. He looked at his hand, then back at her, his jaw tightening into a hard, jagged line of pure, unadulterated arrogance. The monitors in the nearby rooms continued their steady, indifferent beeping, unaware that the quietest woman in the room had just drawn a line in the sand. The silence that followed Hyun-jung's refusal was more than a lack of sound. It was a sudden, pressurized vacuum. Byung-ho's face contorted, his features twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement. To a man who viewed his bank balance as a divine right, a no from a woman in scrubs wasn't just a disagreement, it was an act of heresy. He didn't offer a rebuttal or a warning. Instead, he moved with a sudden, violent agility that betrayed his corporate polish. The sound of the slap was sharp and wet, a sickening crack that echoed off the sterile linoleum and the metallic equipment of the nursing station. Hyun-jung's head snapped to the side, the force of the blow sending a jolt through her spine. She stumbled back, her shoulder hitting the doorframe of room 4. In a reflex born of a mother's instinct rather than a victim's shock, her hand flew immediately to her belly, shielding her 7-month-old child before she even processed the stinging heat blooming across her cheek. Her eyes closed tight for a fleeting second, not in defeat, but in a sudden, terrifying realization. The world she had tried to keep at bay had finally found her. The ICU, a place where every second usually mattered, seemed to freeze in time. Behind the counter, Han Soo-yeon, her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a paralyzed horror. Near the elevators, Kayla Moore and Destiny Harris stood rooted to the spot, their faces reflecting the absolute violation of the sanctuary they worked in. In this unit, they fought death every day, but they had never seen a man attempt to destroy a life so casually. Byung-ho didn't look horrified. He didn't even look regretful. He stood his ground, squaring his shoulders as he adjusted the cuff of his dark suit. A small, chilling smile played at the corners of his mouth, the look of a man who had just re-established the natural order of his universe. "That," he said, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous silk, "was for forgetting who pays the bills in this city. I want this floor cleared of your presence, and I want a real doctor here in 5 minutes." He turned on his heel and walked away, his leather loafers clicking rhythmically against the floor, as if he were strolling through his own boardroom. He didn't look back at the pregnant woman leaning against the wall, nor at the witnesses frozen in shock. He walked away smiling, convinced that his wealth made him untouchable, entirely unaware that the woman he had just struck was the only thing standing between him and a shadow that would soon swallow his entire world. The stinging heat on Hyunjung's cheek had begun to fade into a dull, throbbing ache by the time Dr. Holt, the chief of medicine, arrived. He didn't rush to her side. He didn't ask if the baby was okay or if she needed to sit down. Instead, he walked past the huddled, whispering nurses and went straight to the VIP lounge where Yoon Byung-ho was reportedly resting from the stress of the encounter. When Holt finally emerged, his face was a mask of cold, bureaucratic neutrality. He signaled Hyunjung into his office, a soundproofed sanctuary of mahogany and glass that felt worlds away from the life-saving grit of the ICU. He didn't offer her a chair. "Hyunjung, we have a situation," Holt began, his eyes fixed on a digital file on his desk rather than the red mark blooming across her face. "Mr. Yoon is a foundational pillar of this hospital. His family's trust literally keeps the lights on in this wing. He is deeply distressed by your lack of professional flexibility." "Distressed?" Hyunjung's voice was a whisper of disbelief. He struck a pregnant staff member in front of 4 witnesses because I wouldn't displace a cardiac patient for a scratch? That isn't a lack of flexibility, Dr. Holt. That is a crime. Holt finally looked up, but there was no empathy in his gaze, only the calculated frost of a man protecting a budget. "What I see is a high-stress environment where a misunderstanding occurred. Mr. Yoon claims you were aggressive and physically intimidating. Given the liability and the potential loss of a $4 million endowment, the board has reached a decision." He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a termination notice, effective immediately. "You're firing me?" She felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "I've given 6 years to this unit. I have a clean record. I'm 7 months pregnant." which is why we're offering a modest severance in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement regarding today's incident. If you refuse, we will contest your unemployment and file a countersuit for workplace provocation. You're a talented nurse, Hyunjung, but in this city, money talks. And right now, you're silent. Hyunjung looked at the man she had once respected, seeing him now for what he was, a well-dressed gatekeeper for the cruel and the wealthy. She didn't sign the paper. She didn't argue. She simply stood up, her hand resting firmly on her belly, protecting the only thing that mattered. She walked out of the office, through the gauntlet of her pitying colleagues, and turned in her badge. As she crossed the threshold of the hospital, leaving behind the normal life she had meticulously crafted, the cold rain of soul began to fall. She was no longer a nurse. She was a woman with nothing left to lose, and a husband who was about to find out that his silence was no longer required. The cold soul rain didn't just dampen Hyunjung's clothes, it seemed to seep into her very bones as she stood on the curb watching the hospital's emergency lights blur into jagged streaks of red and blue. She reached into her pocket to call a car, but her banking app flashed a clinical, heartless notification. Account restricted. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She tried her secondary savings account, then her credit card. Each one returned the same error. Byung-ho hadn't just taken her job, he was erasing her existence. He had filed an emergency injunction alleging professional malpractice and theft of proprietary medical data, a baseless charge designed for one purpose, to freeze her assets and paralyze her before she could fight back. By the time she reached her small apartment, she found a legal notice taped to the door, a safety violation eviction, fast-tracked by the building's holding company, another entity, she realized, likely nestled deep within Byung-ho's corporate portfolio. The apartment was dark, the power already cut under the guise of an emergency maintenance order. Hyunjung sat on the edge of her bed in the shadows, the silence of the room weighing heavier than the chaos of the ICU. For 6 years, she had meticulously built this life. She had paid her own taxes, bought her own groceries, and cherished the simple, exhausted peace of a woman who owed no one anything. She had wanted to prove that she could survive without the blood-stained safety net of the park name. Her hand trembled as she reached under the loose floorboard beneath her nightstand. She pulled out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside lay a phone that had never been charged, yet its battery was full, a just-in-case device Jin-woo had given her the day they married. "If the world ever stops making sense," he had whispered back then, "press the only button on the screen. I will handle the rest." She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the phone, seeing the faint, yellowish bruise forming on her cheek where the billionaire's hand had landed. She thought of the patient in room 4 who might have died if she hadn't stood her ground. She thought of the child moving restlessly in her womb, sensing her mother's distress. Hyunjung realized then that her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. To protect the normal life she loved, she had to summon the man who represented everything she had fled. With a steady finger, she pressed the icon on the screen. There was no ringing tone, no digital chirp, only a heavy, expectant silence that lasted 3 seconds before a voice, deeper than the shadows in the room, answered. "Hyunjana?" Jin-woo asked. He didn't ask why she was calling. He didn't ask where she was. He simply waited. "Jin-woo," she breathed, her voice finally breaking. "I'm ready to come home." Yoon Byung-ho sat in the back of his chauffeured sedan, the leather cool against his back as he scrolled through his phone with a satisfied smirk. He had already forgotten the name of the nurse he had struck, classifying her as a minor inconvenience successfully neutralized. In his world, people like her were meant to be moved aside like debris on a construction site. He was already composing a celebratory email to his board of directors, oblivious to the fact that the digital world he dominated was beginning to turn cold. The first sign was a flicker on his tablet, a simple notification from his primary offshore holding in the Cayman Islands. Authentication error. He frowned, tapping the screen with an impatient grunt. Then came another from his Zurich account. Balance $0.00. He froze, his thumb hovering over the glass as a cold, prickling sensation climbed the back of his neck. He refreshed the screen, but the zeros remained, stark and clinical. Miles away, in a room devoid of natural light, a group of men who didn't exist on any payroll worked in absolute silence. They didn't use the clumsy, loud tactics of corporate raiders. They moved with the surgical precision of the shadow world Park Jin-woo commanded. Using backdoors into encrypted servers that Byung-ho's engineers hadn't even discovered yet, they began a systematic, quiet collection. It wasn't just money moving, it was the entire infrastructure of Byung-ho's life being disassembled. His private shell companies were being re-registered to charitable foundations in East Africa. His stock options, once worth billions, were being flooded into the open market through high-frequency trading bots, triggering sell orders that tanked his net worth in a matter of seconds. The invisible hand of the Korea Mafia didn't just take his wealth, it erased the digital footprints that proved he had ever owned it. Byung-ho's phone began to vibrate, a frantic call from his chief financial officer. Before he could answer, the call dropped. The signal bar on his phone vanished, replaced by a single, pulsing red icon, a wolf's eye. The billionaire looked out the window, a sudden, sharp fear piercing through his arrogance. The city lights of Seoul felt different now, less like a playground and more like a cage. He reached for his door handle, but the electronic locks engaged with a heavy, final thud. The driver, a man he had employed for 3 years, didn't look back. He simply kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road, following a route that was no longer programmed into Byung-ho's GPS. The billionaire was finally realizing that while he played with the law, he was now being handled by the lawless. And in that world, there were no injunctions, no appeals, and no mercy. The rain had transitioned into a heavy, suffocating mist by the time the sedan door finally clicked open. Yoon Byung-ho stumbled onto the pavement of a deserted side street, his breath hitching in the damp air. His driver pulled away without a word, leaving him standing in front of the neon-lit facade of a high-end private security firm, the kind of place that handled discreet complications for the city's elite. Byung-ho burst through the glass doors, his wetsuit clinging to him like a second skin. "I need an extraction team and a digital forensics expert," he demanded, slamming his hand onto the reception desk. "Now, I'll pay triple your retainer." The receptionist, a former Special Forces operator who had seen everything, started to reach for a client intake form. Then he glanced at Byung-ho's phone, which was still clutched in the billionaire's trembling hand. The screen was frozen, displaying nothing but the pulsing crimson icon of a wolf's eye. The receptionist's hand stopped midair. He looked at the icon, then up at Byung-ho, and slowly retracted the form. He said, "We're closed." "We're closed? The sign says 24 hours. I am a Tier 1 client. Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," the man replied, standing up and stepping away from the desk as if Byung were carrying a plague. And I know what that mark means. If we help you, we won't have a building to stand in by sunrise. Leave. Now." Byung-ho fled back into the rain, his panic turning into a cold, hollow dread. He went to his lawyer's penthouse, but the door stayed locked, his calls going straight to a disconnected tone. He went to the offices of a high-priced fixer who specialized in making legal problems disappear, only to find the man hurriedly packing a suitcase. The fixer didn't even let him in the door. He simply pointed at the red reflection of the wolf's eye on the window glass and shook his head. "You hit the one person in this city who was off limits, Byung-ho. There isn't enough money in the world to fix a death warrant from the Park family." Standing on a street corner, the billionaire looked around at the towering skyscrapers he once thought he commanded. Every screen in the district, from the news tickers to the giant advertising billboards, seemed to flicker as he passed. The stock prices for his companies weren't just falling, they were being delisted in real time. For the first time in his life, Yoon Byung-ho understood the true meaning of power. It wasn't about the numbers in a bank account or the names on a building. It was the ability to make a man vanish while he was still standing in the middle of a crowded street. He was still breathing, but in the eyes of the city, he was already a ghost. The rain at the private airfield didn't fall, it hung in the air like a heavy gray shroud. Yoon Byung-ho scrambled toward the open hangar, his lungs burning and his vision blurred. His Gulfstream sat on the tarmac, its engines whining with a promise of escape, but as he neared the boarding stairs, the sound suddenly died. The cabin lights flickered and went dark. The pilot, a man Byung-ho had paid millions, stepped out of the cockpit, descended the stairs without a word, and walked into the mist. "Wait! Where are you going?" Byung-ho screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. From the shadows of the hangar, a single figure emerged. Park Jin-woo didn't look like a monster. He wore a simple, dark overcoat, his hands buried in his pockets, his expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. He moved with a terrifying, predatory stillness that made the billionaire's knees buckle. Behind him, 4 men stood like statues, their presence radiating a cold, clinical violence. Byung-ho fell to his knees on the wet asphalt. "I'll give you anything! Money, stocks, the company! Just tell me what the price is!" Jin-woo stopped a few feet away. He didn't look at the plane or the billionaire's expensive watch. He only looked at the space where the red mark on his wife's face had been. When he spoke, his voice was a low, jagged rasp that seemed to vibrate in Byung-ho's chest. "You think everything has a price because you've never met something you couldn't buy, but you touched the only thing in this world that isn't for sale." One of Jin-woo's men stepped forward, holding a tablet and a digital stylus. On the screen was a single legal document, a total irrevocable transfer of every asset, subsidiary, and patent owned by Yoon Byung-ho to a collective of pediatric hospitals and nursing scholarships across the country. "Sign," Jin-woo commanded. "This is my life's work," Byung-ho wailed, the rain mixing with the tears on his face. "If I sign this, I have nothing." "If you don't sign it," Jin-woo said, stepping closer until his shadow completely engulfed the smaller man, "you won't even have nothing. You'll just be a memory that people are too afraid to talk about." With a hand that shook so violently the stylus nearly snapped, Byung-ho traced his signature across the glass. In that one digital stroke, The billionaire ceased to exist. The empires, the penthouses, and the power evaporated into the soul mist. Jinwoo took the tablet, glanced at the confirmation, and finally turned away. He didn't offer a final word or a glance of pity. He walked toward a waiting black sedan, leaving Byung-ho alone on the freezing tarmac. A man who had spent 40 years building a throne, only to find himself sitting in the dirt. 8 weeks later, the air in the VIP maternity suite of the Seoul Medical Center was warm and smelled of lavender and new life. Seo Hyun-jong sat propped against the pillows, her gaze fixed on the tiny, rhythmic rise and fall of her daughter's chest. The baby, wrapped in a soft white blanket, was a miracle of peace in a world that had tried so hard to break her mother. The hospital was different now. The cold corporate efficiency that had once prioritized endowments over heartbeats had been replaced by a quiet, protective stillness. The board of directors had been dissolved, the investors bought out by a silent holding company whose name appeared on no public records. Hyun-jong didn't need to see the paperwork to know who owned the bricks and mortar surrounding her. She felt it in the way the staff moved, with a new kind of respect that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the woman who had stood her ground. A wet, rhythmic slapping sound drifted in from the hallway, the heavy drag of a mop against linoleum. Hyun-jung looked toward the open door. A man in oversized, stained gray coveralls was working his way down the corridor. His shoulders were hunched, his movements clumsy and strained. When he reached her doorway, he paused, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting second. It was Dr. Holt. The expensive silk ties and mahogany desk were gone, replaced by a janitor's bucket and the smell of industrial bleach. He hadn't been fired. Jinwoo had ensured he remained employed, forced to witness the daily care of the patients he had once been willing to trade for a donor's check. The door creaked further open, and Park Jin-woo stepped inside. He didn't look like the man who had stood on the rain-slicked tarmac. He moved quietly, crossing the room to stand beside the bed. He looked at the baby for a long moment, then at Hyun-jung. His hand, usually so steady and cold, brushed a stray hair from her forehead with a tenderness that belonged only to her. "Is the world quiet enough for you now?" he asked, his voice a low vibration in the peaceful room. Hyun-jung looked at her daughter, then back at the man who had dismantled an empire to protect her. She realized then that she hadn't lost the normal life she fought for. She had simply redefined it. She no longer had to be invisible to be safe. She leaned her head back, a small, tired but real smile touching her lips. "Yes," she whispered, the weight of the past finally lifting. Outside the window, the sun began to break through the Seoul mist, illuminating a city where one man sat in a prison cell with nothing, and a mother held everything she had ever wanted in her arms. The quietest people had moved, and the world was finally at rest. Please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more beautiful story updates. So let listening to the story summary and moral lessons. Story summary. So Hyun-jung, a dedicated 7-month pregnant ICU nurse, meticulously built a normal life for herself from the underworld influence of her husband, Korea Mafia boss Park Jin-woo. Her peaceful existence is shattered when Yoon Byung-ho, an entitled tech billionaire, assaults her in the hospital after she refuses to prioritize his minor injury over a critical patient. The hospital's chief of medicine, Dr. Holt, chooses financial endowment over ethics, firing Hyun-jung to appease the donor. Byung-ho further escalates the conflict by using his legal and corporate power to freeze her bank accounts and evict her. Left with no choice, Hyun-jung activates an emergency contact with her husband. In a swift, silent dismantling, Jin-woo's organization erases Byung-ho's digital and financial existence, forcing him to sign his empire over to charity. The story concludes with the reversal of roles. Byung-ho is imprisoned, Dr. Holt is reduced to a janitor in the hospital now owned by the Park family, and Hyun-jung finds safety in motherhood, accepting that her family's protection is the foundation of her normal life. Moral lessons. 1. Character is not defined by social status. The story highlights the contrast between perceived status and actual character. Byung-ho's wealth gave him a false sense of superiority, leading him to treat a skilled professional as a servant. The lesson is that true power lies in competence and integrity. Hyun-jung, while unchecked arrogance, Byung-ho, is a liability that can lead to a total downfall. Dr. Holt's decision to fire Hyun-jung demonstrates that institutions often prioritize financial survival over moral duty. For professionals, this is an educational reminder that the system is not always a safety net. It emphasizes the importance of having personal boundaries and a support network outside of one's workplace. Hyun-jung's flaw was her insistence on total independence, even when facing a monster who didn't play by the rules. The realistic lesson is that while self-reliance is a virtue, there is no shame in seeking help when an opponent uses systemic or illegal weapons against you. True strength is knowing when to lean on those who support you. Byung-ho used his power loudly to intimidate, while Jin-woo used his power silently to execute. In both professional and personal life, the most significant shifts often happen quietly. The story teaches that the most influential people in a room are often the ones who say the least until it is time to act.